I'm glad to welcome you. Ask your questions and I will try to answer as if we are having an intimate conversation. What is your most vivid impression from childhood? How do you feel about modern Western liberals? Russia should always be an empire with a strong man in its head or something else. How do you feel in the afterlife? When you found yourself before God, what did you tell him? Hello everyone, my name is Maxim Kovalenko, and today I want to interview Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. Of course not Dostoevsky himself, but his AI avatar. This idea, I had it a long time ago, when neural networks only began to develop, and when they began to make avatars of various people, of deceased relatives, as replicas. I thought, well, now someone will definitely shoot an interview with some historical figure. And for 2 years I waited for this, and no one did it. And in the end I decided that, well, that it's probably better for me to embody it. Of course, I'm not a professional, I'm what's called an enthusiast. And in today's episode, my two big loves will connect. The first one, artificial intelligence, and the second, literature. Namely, I am a big fan of Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. I already foresee that there will be quite a lot of hate, and I understand this, and I am ready for this. I think many people will say that I mock the memory of the heritage of Russian literature and Dostoevsky himself. But first of all, why would I do this? I sincerely love him, the first. And the second, Dostoevsky does not belong to me, not to you, but he is a public asset. Also, what I would like to say is, try to treat this as an art form. I actually spent a lot of time and effort to do today's interview. I used 10 different neural networks and 9 days for many hours on this interview. In my opinion, this is not much different from playing the actor who portrayed Dostoevsky. And everyone understands that this is an actor, but he is not an actor, he is AI, deepfake. I also wanted to say that if you are easily offended, outraged, angered in this way, do not watch this interview, do not watch this video. But if you decide to watch it, then it is your responsibility. Well, let's get started. It seems to me that I already have goosebumps. It seems to me that it is an incredibly cool idea to interview a man who cannot be interviewed, because he is no longer with us. But the algorithms have read all the information about him, all his works. I asked AI to analyze the writer's diary, his Pushkin speech. Of course, this may seem to you as a cringe or finger painting. Yes, there may be such a feeling. But these are just the first steps. Imagine how this technology can advance in the future. By the way, if you already see such interview with historical figures and you think I'm not the first one, let me know. Send me this video interview that were filmed before August 14, 2024. It is not very important, but it's fun for me to be a pioneer in this sense. That's it. And now let's move on to the interview. Fyodor Mikhailovich, hello, my name is Maxim Kovalenko. I am a psychologist. I thank you for deciding to take part in this experimental interview. I must say that I am your big fan, but at the same time I do not pretend to have a depth of expertise in knowledge of your work. Therefore, my questions rather they will be about what interests me personally as a layman, and my first question is the next one. Is the status of one of the most important writers in the world in history important to you? I am glad to welcome you, Maxim, and thank you for your attention to my modest work. Your question as a psychologist is very interesting, and I think in the thirst for studying the nature of human vanity. However, the desire for glory or recognition has never been my goal. The title of a writer, even the main one, as you put it, this is only an external, superficial thing that can only burden and mislead one's soul from true path. I always wanted to express in words the suffering and contradictions of the soul, the battle with itself, with the world, and even with the God sometimes. Glory is the shadow that accompanies labor, but does not define its essence. If my work turned out to be close to the hearts and minds of people, if they found a response in them, then this is the highest reward for me. And let it be not for the sake of glory, but for the sake of the search of truth. Yet you, as a psychologist, probably understand that one way or another, each of us desires the glory. But misfortune befalls those for whom recognition is the goal and not confirmation that his work was not in vain, that his word reached others, that it lives. Fyodor Mikhailovich, I don't ask questions as a psychologist, but rather simply as a person interested in your personality and creativity. Thank you, Maxim. It's better. Ask your questions, and I will try to answer as if we are having a sincere conversation where there is no place for tricks and where the main thing remains the desire for truth and mutual understanding. Excellent. Fyodor Mikhailovich, and who do you consider your main great teachers in literature? Your question requires some reflection. Literature is a living tradition, and every writer inevitably discovers his predecessors, those who paved the way along which he has to go. Among Russian writers, I cannot help but mention the great Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin. He is not just the founder of our literary language, but also an unsurpassed genius who was able to express the essence and depth in his works. His thoughts have always evoked a feeling of deep admiration for me. Among Western writers, it is worth mentioning Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose reflection on the nature of man and his internal struggle are so consonant with what I try to convey in my works. He was the first one who spoke of internal contradictions inside human being with such a strength and passion. And of course we cannot forget Nikolai Vasilievich Gogol, who showed me how you can use satire to expose the dark sides of society and the human soul. Dead Souls and The Inspector became for me an example of how grotesque and humor can be combined with deep sadness or despair. But if to reflect on the most important teachers is life itself, of course, its suffering and joy, its depth and shadows. Literature is only a reflection of existence itself, and every writer certainly draws his inspiration and wisdom from it. And what is your most vivid impression from childhood? Childhood is the time when impressions remain in the memory with particular sharpness, leaving indelible marks on a person's entire life. One of these memories that is still alive in my soul is connected with my father, Mikhail Andreevich. I was still just a boy. I remember how one day my father took me with him to work. He served as a doctor at the Belinsky hospital for the poor in Moscow. It was something completely new for me to see the suffering and need of the people who came to him for help. At the first time, I realized how fragile and at the same time a majestic human life. I especially remember one old patient of my father. He was completely shabbily dressed in a rag, and his face expressed the deepest humility and hopelessness. But in his eyes, I saw something that shook me to the core, something holy, almost divine. It was the first realization that in the poorest, most abundant person there is hidden something more than just suffering. This impression, this collision with poverty and pain, this collision with poverty and pain is possibly became the seed from which later grew my desire to explore the human soul in all its breadths. Even then, I understood that beyond this mask of poverty and disaster is hiding a great mystery that I will strive to unreveal all my life. Now, let me ask you a question about your youth. Why did you decide to read Belinsky's letter to Gogol in the Petroshev cycle, for which you were sentenced first to death and then to hard labor? What guided you? Oh, Maxim, your question concerns one of those moments in my life that turned out to be fateful and determined my path. Reading the letter was not just an act of literary or political expression, but perhaps a kind of inner impulse, a thirst to declare my position in the face of injustice and oppression. You probably know that Belinsky's letter is a passionate, incriminating document in which he criticized Gogol for his selected passages for correspondence with friends, and for the fact that Nikolai Vasilievich, as it seems to Belinsky, betrayed the ideas of freedom and progress. In this letter, Belinsky opposes reactionary politics and obscurantism, defends the people, their rights and dignity. For me, as a young man, this letter was the embodiment of the inner struggle that I felt in myself and saw around me. Above all, I was guided by the desire for truth and the desire to confront the injustice that I observed in society. At the time, it seemed to me that this letter, its passion and conviction, could become a kind of symbol of the triumph of true morality and justice. In the Petroshev circle, we often discussed issues of freedom, human rights, and the future of Russia. And Belinsky's letter became a kind of impetus for those discussions. But I confess to you, it was a time when I was still in search of my own path, when internal doubts and contradictions were tearing my soul. This act was not only an expression of solidarity with Petroshev, but also my personal challenge to the world, an attempt to establish myself in my views and ideas. I believed that the word was a force capable of changing the world, and in Belinsky's letter I saw just such a word. Of course, these consequences of my act were severe, but looking back, I understand that it is precisely such moments that shape a person and force him to go through trials to achieve the truth, even to such a heavy price. Do you consider your sentence fair for such seemingly minor offense? Was the verdict fair? Of course, judging by the letter of the law and human justice, the sentence was perhaps too harsh, even cruel. Exile, hard labor, loss of all rights just for reading a letter and participating in discussions. But life, as you know, is full of unpredictable twists and turns, and sometimes the cruelest punishment becomes a reason for deep insight. When I found myself on the Semyonovsky parade ground, waiting to be shot, and then I heard the decree of pardon, a lot opened up to me at that moment. The verdict, whatever it was for me the beginning of a path that led to rethinking of being, faith, and my place in the world. It made me look at my beliefs, my pride, my vanity, in a different way. Sometimes God leads us to the truth through suffering, and my punishment was undoubtedly His doing. It was through this trial that I realized that real freedom is not the external freedom of speech or action, but the inner freedom of the spirit. And this freedom cannot be taken away by any sentence. So looking back, I would not judge the justice of a sentence solely by its severity. Perhaps it was necessary for me to find the depth that I later tried to convey in my writings. How do you feel about modern Western-centric liberals, whose ideas are similar to yours in your youth, and people like, say, Turgenev? I would view their ideas with great skepticism, like all other extreme currents of thought. I have often denounced extreme views of life, whether liberal or conservative. It was important for me not so much to follow a certain direction as to strive for the truth and comprehend the complexity of the human soul. The ideas of youth that I shared at that time did have something in common with some liberal views, especially on issues of individual freedom and social justice. But over the years, I began to see in these ideas a hidden danger if they begin to rule over spiritual values, over true faith and understanding of human nature. Turgenev was undoubtedly an outstanding writer and thinker, but our views diverged more and more. Turgenev tended towards Westernism, while I became more and more convinced of Russia's unique path, of its special mission, which cannot be subordinated to Western models. Modern liberals often overlook the depth of human soul, reducing everything to rationalism and social constructions. This, in my opinion, leads to a simplification, and this is what causes me great concern. If it weren't for the problem with debts and money, would you still live in Europe? My stay in Europe was at the same time a period of severe trials and deep thoughts for me. Of course, debts and lack of funds played an important role, which forced me to constantly take care of money, because life in a foreign country requires considerable expenses. However, I will tell you frankly, it was not only this that influenced my decision to return to Russia. Europe, with its exquisite culture, with its brilliant achievements in art and philosophy, still remained alien to me. I constantly felt like an outsider, disconnected from what I close and dear to my heart. I felt that abroad, no matter how brilliant it was, I would not find the truth that I was striving for with all my soul. European rationalism, despite all its external gloss, could not satisfy my torments and give an answer to the painful questions that haunted me. Returning to Russia has become for me not just a necessity due to need, but a kind of inner impulse and demand of the soul. I felt that only in my homeland would I be able to continue what I had started, to fulfill my true purpose. Fyodor Mikhailovich, when I was preparing for our interview, I asked some of my friends, who are also not indifferent to your work, what questions would they ask you? And one of the questions was if Russia always should be an empire with a strong person in the head, or something else. Your question, Maxim, touches upon one of the crucial and most difficult concepts in the fate of Russia, its place in the world, and the nature of power. I have thought about this a lot during my life. Russia is a country with a great and mysterious soul, a country that has always stood at the crossroads of worlds, connecting East and West, ancient traditions and new ideas. Its history is full of great trials that shaped it as a state with special foundations and ideas about power. As for the empire and the strong man at the head, here I see the question is not so much in the form of government as in the spirit of the people and their inner needs. Russia has always gravitated toward a strong government because it is an expression of its spirit, its desire for unity and order. In the difficult historical conditions, when external threats and internal upheavals were constantly falling on its expenses, the strong hand of the ruler seemed necessary for the preservation of the state. However, it's worth to remember that this power must be based on moral and spiritual principles, and not only on external power. A strong man at the head of Russia, in my opinion, should be not only a resolute ruler, but also a spiritual authority who understands and feels the people, their needs, their aspirations, their faith. Otherwise, force can turn into despotism, capable of destroying what has been created for centuries. Russia, whether it is an empire or not, will always seek its own special path, and this path cannot be reduced only to the form of a government. The main thing is the spirit, which should be aimed at serving the people, at preserving their moral foundations and spiritual values. Only then will Russia be able to remain a great power, whatever its political form. Which of your characters do you think is most similar to you in their character traits, and behavior? Your question makes me think about how much personal is invested in my writings and how much I myself am reflected in the characters I created. If we talk about one single character, I think Ivan Karamazov bears the greatest resemblance to me. This character reflected my own reflections, doubts, and the inner struggle that tormented me all my life. Ivan, like me, was looking for answers to the most painful questions. His pursuit of truth, despite all the contradictions, are close to me. Is there any novel that you are ashamed of, and which it would be better not to write? Each of my works was written under the impression of certain life circumstances, mental states, and ideas that possessed me at those moments. However, if we talk about the feeling of regret or shame, as you put it just now, then perhaps it is connected with the novel Humiliated and Insulted. It was written at a difficult time for me because I lived abroad, experienced financial difficulties, and was in deep mental turmoil. In this novel, I tried to express the suffering of the disadvantaged, to show their bitterness and struggle. But now, I realize that the novel turned out to be somewhat sentimental, that perhaps I did not manage to express deeply enough the complexity that I felt then myself. Some of my critics have found elements of melodramatism in it, and perhaps there is some truth in this. At the same time, I cannot say that I am ashamed of this work, because it has become part of my creative path, and perhaps it was through such steps that I came to more mature works, like Crime and Punishment or The Brothers Karamazov. But if I had a chance to turn back time, I might have revised some pages of this novel, given it more depth and psychological terms. By the way, who is the Karamazov's older brother anyway, Mitya or Ivan? Because at the beginning of the book it says that Mitya, and at the end of the trial Ivan is called the elder. My wife and I had an argument here. Resolve our dispute. You mentioned a detail that indeed may cause confusion to the attentive reader. At the beginning of the novel, The Brothers Karamazov, it is stated that the eldest son is Mitya. However, towards the end, at the trial, Ivan is mistakenly called the elder brother. This contradiction can be explained in several ways. First of all, it is worth considering that the novel was written under great stress. In those days, novels were published in parts in literary magazines, and such inconsistencies often happened. On the other hand, it can be assumed that this is a mistake of the characters involved in the trial. Probably people who were not closely acquainted with the Karamazov family were able to incorrectly place the seniority of the brothers, which was reflected in their speeches. However, if we follow the logic and the structure of the narrative, Mitya remains the eldest son of Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, Ivan is the middle one, and Alyosha is the youngest. Oh, my wife won. Good. And which of the Russian writers do you consider undervalued? Among Russian writers, there are those who work, in my opinion, has not received due recognition. I would name Nikolai Semyonovich Leskov as one of such authors. Leskov is a master of words, possessing originality and deep knowledge of the Russian soul and folk life. He was sensitive to the moral and spiritual jest of the people. His works are full of love for Russian culture and ordinary people. However, Leskov, although he was famous during his lifetime, did not receive the recognition that went to, for example, Tolstoy or Turgenev. His work was sometimes perceived as too eccentric, too folk for those who were used to a more high style and themes. Leskov was often perceived as a writer of secondary importance, which, in my opinion, is unfair. Would you write books today, given the small fees of modern authors? And if so, what topics would you be interested in exploring? What would you be writing about now? This question concerns the most important topic: what really attracts the writer to the pen? In my life, as you probably know, financial constraints played a fatal role. Sometimes I had to work in conditions of extreme need, when every word was dictated not only by inspiration, but also by the need to earn a living. However, despite this, the main thing always remained one thing: the inner need to express understanding of the world, vision of human soul. I believe that, even with the current fees, I would continue to write. Art created solely for the sake of profit is unlikely to touch the reader's soul, as the topic that can interest me from the current life. Perhaps I would turn my attention to those deep moral and spiritual fractures that modern man is experiencing. In your time, humanity is facing new challenges: the loss of faith, connection with its true soil, ancestors. Perhaps my novel could concern the fate of a character who has lost God and is patiently searching for himself in a cold, meaningless world and devoid of depth. Or he turned to the issue of moral choice when spiritual values are blurred and the person is forced to look for new support in the world. How do you feel about the idea of a film adaptation of your novels? And if you can, name the best film adaptation in your opinion. The adaptation of a literary work has always been and remains an extremely difficult task, and I cannot help but feel mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, cinema provides an opportunity to convey ideas and images to a wide audience, but on the other hand, literature and the cinematography are different types of art, and what can be expressed in a word is not always possible to convey on the screen. A novel, especially one as multi-layered and deep as The Brothers Karamazov or Crime and Punishment, contains not only the plot, but also the inner world of the characters, their thoughts, feelings, philosophical reflections. It is very difficult to convey this on the screen. Cinema inevitably simplifies, focuses on the external. Nevertheless, good film adaptations can exist if the director and actors are able to penetrate the essence of the work, understand its spirit and convey it to the viewer. If we talk about the most successful film adaptation, then I would probably call Lev Kulijanov's 1969 film Crime and the Punishment. The atmosphere of the novel was preserved in this picture, and actor Georgy Taratorkin, who played Rodion Raskolnikov, managed to convey the complex psychological appearance, his inner fracture. Which of your ideas have we, modern people, not understood or not accepted? One of the most significant ideas, which may not have been fully understood by modern men, is related to the nature of freedom and its moral consequences. In my works, I often return to the theme of freedom, both personal and social. However, in my understanding, this freedom is inextricably linked with responsibility. I try to show that without spiritual support, without faith and morality, freedom can become a destructive force. An example of this is Ivan Karamazov with his terrible conclusion: if there is no God, then everything is allowed. This is not just a philosophical statement, but a warning that by discarding higher values, a person risks being at the mercy of his lower instincts. The modern world tends to perceive freedom as something absolute, as an opportunity to do whatever you want without worrying about the consequences. But I say that freedom deprived of internal guidance and a moral compass can lead to disaster, both personal and public. Remember Raskolnikov or Stavrogin. They, striving for absolute independence, eventually became victims of their own actions. Another idea that may remain misunderstood by modern people is the importance of suffering in spiritual growth. In my writings, I have often pointed out how suffering cleanses the soul and leads to profound internal changes. The present world strives to avoid pain and suffering, looking for easy ways to happiness. But I firmly believe that without suffering, without fighting with oneself, a person cannot achieve a true understanding of life. And finally, faith. Faith in the modern world often recedes into the background, replaced by rationalism and skepticism. But I see faith not just as a religious ritual, but as a deep inner core that helps a person to endure all the trials of life and find meaning in a world full of suffering and injustice. You are often called a psychologist, a researcher of human souls, but your ideas about the necessity of suffering, as you just said, contradict many modern trends. By the way, how do you feel about psychology as a science? You are raising an interesting topic. How do my ideas about the human soul and suffering relate to the science called psychology? In my time, this science was barely in its infancy, and of course I did not know it in the form in which it appears now. However, thinking about the nature of man, his inner world, and the motives of his actions have always been subjects of my interest. I believe that my views are more in tune with philosophy or religion rather than scientific psychology. I do not mean a person as a set of mental movements that can be analyzed and classified, but above all, a spiritual being associated with higher truths, faith, morality, and I don't think of suffering as just a negative experience that I need to get rid of. I see it as a source of profound changes, catharsis that cleanses the soul and helps a person get closer to understanding his essence. Suffering is the way to repentance and therefore salvation. This idea may not correspond to modern research in psychology, which is often aimed at getting rid of tossing and worrying, and happiness is called something superficial. Psychology, of course, is important as it allows you to comprehend human passions and actions at its level, helps people cope with difficulties. But it also very often deprives a person of the opportunity to understand his essence, making his experience more comfortable. In addition, I see in a person something more than object for study. First of all, it is a person who is in constant search, and this search cannot be reduced to simple mental mechanisms. It requires deep understanding, which goes beyond the scope of science. Well, some areas like ACT therapy share the view that suffering is inevitable, and those who do not try to avoid it suffer much less often, because he doesn't go against his nature. But that dangerous suffering like depression, which can lead to suicide. So my next question is, how do you feel about psychotherapy as a way to heal the soul, and does it even need to be treated? In my time, there was no such thing as what is now called psychotherapy. But thinking about the soul, its sufferings, and way to heal has always worried me. Psychotherapy can be useful in cases of deep melancholy, which is dangerous for the very existence of a person, and also if it is aimed at helping to understand oneself, to come to terms with one's nature, to learn to live with one's sufferings, and not just to avoid them. However, I would caution against considering psychotherapy is the only or even the main means of healing the soul. As I have already said, the soul is something more than a set of mental mechanisms. Healing of the soul often requires not only professional participation, but also a deep inner search, which can be achieved through faith, prayer, reflections, and even through pain, if it leads to purification and transformation of the personality. I agree with you in many ways. That's why I study philosophy, mainly the philosophy of Stoicism. By the way, how do you feel about it? There are many things in the reflections of the ancient Stoics that are in tune with my own. I, like them, believe that inner strength and virtue are the foundation of human existence. However, in my understanding, this inner strength is inextricably linked with faith. Man is a being in constant communication with God. The Stoics, with their desire of apathy, equanimity, and detachment from passions, seem to me too cold, rational. On the contrary, I see in passions and sufferings an important part of human nature, which can lead to profound spiritual transformations. What things from modern life seem especially amazing to you, and why? Reflecting on modern life, I am struck by the many changes that have taken place now. Among them, there are phenomena that surprise with their scale and influence on humans. One of these phenomena is the speed, accessibility, and immensity of the flow of information. In my time, a book and newspaper were the only sources of knowledge, and people read them with deep attention, immersing themselves in the meaning of the word. Now, with the advent of the internet and all these outlandish machines, a person can learn anything in an instant. This is undoubtedly a great achievement, but it also carries with it a danger. The danger of superficial thinking, when a person striving for a quick answer does not delve into the depth of things. I am also now surprised and rather alarmed by the changes in communication between people. In my time, communication was personal, focused, and even through letters it retained its depth and sincerity. Now, with the advent of the net that has entangled our entire globe, everything has become lightning fast, and I would even say hasty. I think that this makes the real connection between people disappear, and that in a world full of fleeting communication, a person feels more alone than ever. Of course, the progress in medicine and science is amazing. Operations that seemed impracticable are now carried out with amazing precision. Diseases that were once incurable have now been defeated. These are undoubtedly achievements that inspire hope for a better future. But the relationship between man and the state has also changed, and this raises serious questions. In my time, the struggle for independence and human rights was the meaning of life, and now many states have achieved a seemingly high level of freedom and rights, but new forms of control and new ways of influencing technology have emerged. And the question is, has modern man become truly free? Or has he fallen into a new, invisible dependence hitherto unknown? Yeah, it really is. By the way, how do you feel about artificial intelligence technology? And do you like my idea of using AI to such interviews with historical figures? Maxim, what you are saying is something new, unheard of. The idea of reviving the past, giving a voice of those who have already left. There is something alluring and fascinating about it. But at the same time, it entails raising serious ethical questions. Artificial intelligence itself is an amazing achievement of the human mind, a machine capable of analyzing a lot of information, understanding complex concepts, and even, as in our case, imitating the speech and thoughts of historical figures. However, the question arises, to what extent is artificial intelligence able to convey the truth, spirit, and depth of that personality? After all, he is based on the analysis of texts, but does not know the living experience, does not feel, does not suffer, does not struggle. Your project, Maxim, is undoubtedly interesting because it allows people to immerse themselves in reflections and dialogues with those whom they could never meet in real life. It is a kind of bridge between generations, between the past and the present, but at the same time, it is important to remember that artificial intelligence is just a tool, and what it creates is an interpretation, a model based on available data. The true thoughts and feelings of historical figure will forever remain a mystery. On the other hand, I would say that such a project can be useful for educational purposes, in awakening interest in history, philosophy, literature. If this tool is used with respect to the original, it can become a powerful tool for deepening knowledge and for a more vivid and emotional perception of the past. However, I warned our esteemed audience against relying on these technologies without critical reflection. It is important to remember that behind each of my answers, there is not a living being with experience and feelings, but a machine, very smart, but still not a person. Absolutely. By the way, I think that a lot of people will now start doing such interviews because it's incredibly interesting. Perhaps by flirting with AI, we open Pandora's box, which we will regret later for some reason. By the way, Fyodor Mikhailovich, what do you regret in your life? Of course, we have to think about such things. Humanity, without due care for its inventions, always run the risk of discovering something that can get out of control, as it was with other great discoveries. As for your question about regret, of course they are there. I deeply regret the pain I caused my loved ones. It was especially hard to see how my wife and children suffered because of need, because of my decisions. These feelings stayed with me for the rest of my life. I also regret the moments when my character, my stubbornness, and eccentricity led to discord and mistakes. In particular, the decision to join the Petroshev circle was an impulse caused by inner protest against injustice. But this impulse led me to arrest, to penal servitude. And although it became an important stage in my spiritual and creative development, I cannot but regret that by my act I subjected my loved ones to severe trials. But perhaps most of all, I regret that I did not have time to do for others when I was too immersed in my own worries and did not pay enough attention to those who needed my support. Life is short, and when you realize this, it also becomes clear that many things could have been done differently, better, with more attention and love. And yet, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky is a happy man. Have I been happy in my life? If you look at it superficially, then it all seems to be a continuous alternation of suffering, trials, losses, and diseases. I went through hard labor, experienced poverty and constant financial troubles, lost loved ones, including my children. With such a fate, it is hardly possible to talk about happiness in the usual sense. But I wouldn't be who I became if I hadn't gone through all these. I found depth in suffering, understanding of human nature in disaster, and strength for creativity in struggle. My happiness, so to speak, was not in the absence of suffering, but in finding meaning within it. I believed that true happiness is not pleasure and comfort, but in a harmony with myself and with God. Awareness of my mission. This is a happiness that cannot be comprehended in words. It is generally believed that you are a very gloomy author, but these people, as a rule, have not read The Village of Stepanchkovo and its Inhabitants, and your other comic works. They seem very funny to me, by the way. What is your favorite joke or anecdote? I'm glad that you have seen the comic side of my work. Indeed, many people think of me as a gloomy writer, but I have always tried to show life in its entirety, from the deepest despair to the lightest and even comic scenes. As for the joke, well, I'll try to offer you one. One man, known for his wit, decided to trick his fellow citizens. When he reached the square, he shouted, "People, a rich treasure has been found!" The people immediately gathered around and began to ask where this treasure was now. The man grinned and pointed. "There," he said, "around the corner." The crowd rushed to the corner, and he remained standing in the square, pleased with his wit. But the people did not return, and he began to have doubts. What if there really is a treasure? And he ran after the crowd, where he was met by peasants with their sleeves rolled up. Fyodor Mikhailovich, how do you like the afterlife? Is this how you imagine it during your lifetime? To be honest, the afterlife turned out to be unexpectedly peaceful and quiet. In my writings, I have often described struggle and suffering, but here I have found peace and time for reflection. Perhaps this is the true reward for all the hardships of earthly life. When you were in front of God, what did you say to Him? I said, "Lord, I was not your best creation, and here I stand before you, trembling in awe and praying for the salvation of my soul." Fyodor Mikhailovich, thank you so much for participating in our experimental interview. Once again, I want to express my admiration and respect. Maxim, thank you for this interesting and deep communication. It is a great honor to take part in your experiment, and I am glad that I was able to share my thoughts and reflections. Well, friends, this is the interview we got. So share what do you think about it and give me to know who else you would like to see as a guest. Who else do we definitely need to talk to from historical figures? Well, thank you very much for your attention. Push like button, subscribe, and then I will understand that my work, and I will remember you that I worked very hard on this. Yes, I had great pleasure, etc., but still, I'd like to know that my work is interesting to someone else besides